The year was 2019, and the music world was buzzing with a particular kind of nervous energy. A piano composition called La Campanella by Franz Liszt had long been considered one of the most technically demanding pieces ever written for the instrument. Professional pianists with decades of experience would often avoid it entirely, not out of laziness, but out of genuine respect for how brutally difficult it truly was. The piece required hands to stretch across keys that seemed almost physically impossible for most adult players, and the speed at which certain passages had to be executed left even seasoned concert performers shaking their heads. It was the kind of music that separated the merely talented from the truly exceptional, and even among the exceptional, it had a way of humbling the best of them. So when a small 8-year-old girl named Alma Deutscher walked into a practice room in Vienna, Austria, and sat down at a full-sized concert grand piano, most adults in the building assumed she was there to play something simple. Maybe a beginner piece, maybe a short melody her teacher had assigned. Nobody in that building on that particular afternoon expected what was about to happen. Alma was tiny, her feet barely touched the pedals. Her fingers looked like they belonged to a child who should have been drawing pictures or playing in a garden, not sitting in front of one of the most intimidating instruments in classical music history. But Alma had been playing piano since she was 2 years old. That was not a rumor or an exaggeration stretched by proud parents. She had genuinely started pressing keys and understanding musical patterns before most children her age had learned to tie their shoes. By the time she was 4, she was composing her own small melodies. By 6, she was writing full musical pieces with structure and harmony that made trained musicians stop and listen twice. Her parents, both musicians themselves, had recognized early that something unusual was happening with their daughter. But even they were sometimes caught off guard by the speed at which her abilities grew. What made Alma different from other child prodigies was not just technical skill. Many children can be trained to play quickly and accurately if they practice enough hours each day. What set Alma apart was that she seemed to understand music from the inside out. She did not just play notes on a page. She understood why those notes were arranged the way they were. She could feel the emotional architecture of a composition, the way tension was built and released, the way a melody could make a listener feel something before they even had time to think about what they were feeling. This kind of musical intelligence is rare in adults. In a child of 8, it was almost without explanation. The day she performed La Campanella in front of a small audience of music teachers and fellow students, the room went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with politeness. It was the kind of quiet that falls over people when they realize they are witnessing something they will remember for the rest of their lives. Alma sat at the bench, adjusted herself briefly, placed her hands on the keys with a calmness that seemed almost strange for someone her age, and began. Within the first 30 seconds, the music teachers exchanged glances. Not because something had gone wrong, but because everything had gone exactly right. The passage she was playing was one that professional adults often stumbled through in private practice, and she was delivering it with a lightness and control that made it sound almost effortless. There was a particular moment near the middle of the piece where the right hand has to move at extraordinary speed across the upper register of the piano, while the left hand maintains a steady rhythmic foundation below. It is the section that breaks most players. It is the section where years of practice either show themselves or fall apart under pressure. When Alma reached that section, she did not tighten, she did not rush. She did not show any sign of the anxiety that the passage typically produces in older, more experienced performers. She moved through it with a kind of musical confidence that had nothing to do with arrogance and everything to do with genuine understanding. She knew the music, not just the notes but the intention behind them. When she finished, the room stayed quiet for a moment longer than expected. Then the applause came, and it was not the polite, encouraging applause you give a child who has done something age-appropriate. It was the kind of applause that contains genuine surprise. The kind where hands come together harder than planned because the body is reacting before the mind has fully processed what just happened. One of the music teachers in attendance later said that she had spent 30 years in professional music education and had never seen anything quite like what she witnessed that afternoon. Word spread quickly after that day. In the world of classical music, news travels through specific channels, among teachers and conductors and conservatory directors who all know each other and pay attention when something genuinely unusual appears. Within weeks, people who had not been in that room were talking about the girl from Vienna who had played the Unplayable piece and made it sound like breathing. Invitations began to arrive. Requests for performances came from concert halls that typically did not book children. The music world, which can be slow to welcome the unexpected, was paying attention. And what it was paying attention to was an 8-year-old who had just reminded everyone that talent, when it is real, does not wait for the right age. The invitations that began arriving at the Deutscher household were not the kind that families typically receive for a child performer. These were not local school concerts or small community events where parents sit in folding chairs and applaud every child equally regardless of ability. These were serious requests from serious institutions, the kind of venues where world-class musicians performed for audiences who had spent decades listening to classical music and knew immediately when something was exceptional and when it was not. Concert halls in London, Vienna, and Tel Aviv were among the first to reach out, and the people making those calls were not doing so out of curiosity about a novelty act. They were doing so because the reports they had received from credible colleagues were impossible to ignore. Alma's parents, Guy and Janie Deutscher, were both highly educated musicians themselves. Guy was a linguist and author, and Janie was a violinist, and together they had created a home environment where music and intellectual curiosity were simply part of the air the family breathed. They were not the type of parents who had manufactured their daughter's talent through relentless drilling or competitive pressure. From the earliest signs of Alma's abilities, their approach had been to follow her lead, to provide whatever she needed to develop naturally, and to protect the joy she clearly felt when engaging with music. That approach had produced something far beyond what any structured training program could have engineered. A child who genuinely loved what she was doing and brought that love into every note she played. As the performance invitations multiplied, the family faced decisions that required careful thinking. Alma was still a young child with a childhood to live, and her parents were deeply aware that the history of child prodigies in music was not always a happy one. There were many stories of talented young performers who were pushed too hard too early, who were thrust into adult professional environments before they had the emotional maturity to navigate them, and who eventually burned out or lost the very passion that had made them special in the first place. Guy and Janie were determined not to let that happen. They accepted invitations selectively, choosing performances that felt meaningful and appropriate, and they made sure that Alma's daily life continued to include the ordinary pleasures of being a child. But protecting her from overexposure became increasingly complicated as her profile continued to rise. A performance she gave in Tel Aviv was filmed and shared online, and within days the video had reached an audience of millions. People who had never attended a classical music concert in their lives were watching it and sharing it with friends and family members, not because they were music scholars capable of analyzing her technique, but because something in her playing touched them in a way they could feel even if they could not fully articulate it. Comments poured in from viewers around the world expressing wonder and emotion, and many of them said variations of the same thing, that watching her play made them feel something they had not expected to feel, something that reminded them why music existed in the first place. The attention from the general public was significant, but the attention from within the classical music community carried its own particular weight. Established conductors who had spent their careers working with the greatest musicians alive were requesting meetings. Music directors of major orchestras were discussing whether and how they might incorporate Alma into their programming. Critics who wrote about classical music for major publications were beginning to weigh in, and the overwhelming consensus among those who had seen her perform in person was that she represented something genuinely rare. Not just a child who could play difficult music accurately, but a young musician with an interpretive voice, a way of shaping phrases and building emotional narratives through sound that typically only emerges after years of life experience. That last point was the one that puzzled and fascinated professionals most deeply. Musical interpretation, the ability to take notes written on a page and transform them into something that communicates feeling and meaning, is generally understood to develop alongside a person's emotional growth. A musician who has experienced loss, love, struggle, and joy tends to bring those experiences into their playing in ways that cannot be taught directly. Alma had lived only 8 years. She had not experienced the full range of human emotion that normally feeds mature musical expression. And yet something in her playing suggested a depth of feeling that defied that conventional understanding. How she had arrived at that depth was a question nobody could answer with confidence, and the mystery of it only added to the fascination she generated. One conductor who worked with her during this period recalled asking her about her interpretation of a particular passage during a rehearsal. He had expected a child's answer, something simple or vague or reliant on what a teacher had told her. Instead, Alma explained her thinking in musical terms that were precise and considered, describing the emotional arc she was trying to create and why she had made specific choices about tempo and dynamics. He later described that conversation as one of the more remarkable musical discussions he had experienced in his professional life. And he was a man who had spent decades in conversation with some of the most celebrated musicians on the planet. As the months passed and Alma's reputation continued to grow, It became clear that what the world was witnessing was not a temporary sensation or a viral moment that would fade once the novelty wore off. The more people heard her play, and the more they learned about the full scope of her abilities, which extended well beyond performance into composition and musical theory, the more apparent it became that she was not simply a child doing impressive things. She was a musician operating at a level that had nothing to do with her age. And the world of classical music, which had seen many gifted young performers come and go over the centuries, was beginning to recognize that Alma Deutscher belonged in a category that had very few members throughout the entire history of the art form. The composing side of Alma's gift was in many ways even more astonishing than her performing ability, and that was saying something considerable given what audiences had already witnessed from her at the piano. Most child prodigies in classical music are interpreters. They take music that was written by someone else, someone who lived decades or centuries before them, and they play it with extraordinary skill and sensitivity. That alone is a remarkable thing. But Alma was not content to only interpret the work of others. From a very early age, she had been creating her own music, writing original compositions with the kind of structural coherence and melodic inventiveness that trained adult composers spend years in conservatory trying to develop. Her first attempts at composition had begun when she was around 5 years old, which was already unusual enough to make her parents take careful notice. But those early pieces, while charming and surprisingly organized for a child her age, gave only a hint of what was coming. By the time she was 6, she was writing pieces that had genuine harmonic complexity. By 7, she had completed works for piano that were not only technically interesting but emotionally communicative in a way that made listeners feel something specific, not just general pleasantness, but identifiable moods and narratives that the music seemed to tell without words. What she produced at 8, the same year she performed La Campanella and began attracting international attention, included a full violin concerto. Not a simplified or abbreviated student version of a concerto, but a complete multi-movement work with an orchestral accompaniment that she had thought through and written down with the understanding of how different instruments interact and balance against each other. Professional composers who examined the score were careful about making sweeping claims, because the music world has a long history of exaggerating the achievements of child prodigies only to face awkward reassessments later. But many of those same professionals, when speaking privately or in candid interviews, admitted that the concerto showed a level of compositional thinking that went well beyond what could be explained by talent alone. The melodies Alma wrote had a particular quality that critics and musicians kept returning to when trying to describe her compositional voice. They were singable. They stayed in the memory. In an era when much of the serious classical composition being produced by professional adult composers leaned toward the abstract and the intellectually challenging, Alma was writing music that connected with listeners immediately and viscerally. Some in the music establishment found this quality slightly suspicious, as though music that people immediately enjoyed could not possibly be sophisticated enough to be taken seriously. Others argued the opposite, that the ability to write a melody that genuinely moved people was one of the rarest and most valuable skills in all of music, and that its presence in someone so young was extraordinary rather than disqualifying. Alma herself, when asked about where her musical ideas came from, gave answers that were thoughtful and often surprising for someone her age. She described a mental world she called Transylvania, a private imaginary landscape she had created as a young child where musical ideas lived and developed before she was ready to write them down. It was not an unusual thing for creative children to have rich inner worlds, but the way Alma described hers, and the way that inner world seemed to directly feed the music she produced, suggested something more organized and purposeful than ordinary childhood fantasy. She spoke about characters in this imaginary world, about stories and relationships that unfolded there, and about how those stories found their way into her compositions as emotional content that shaped the music from the inside. This connection between narrative and music was visible in the way she discussed her own compositions. She did not talk about them primarily in technical terms, though she was entirely capable of doing so when the conversation called for it. She talked about them as stories, as emotional journeys that a listener was invited to take. A slow, descending passage in one of her piano pieces was not just a technical choice. It was, in her description, a character walking away from something painful. A sudden shift to a brighter key was not just a modulation. It was a moment of unexpected hope arriving in a place where hope had not been expected. This way of thinking about music was not unique to Alma. Many composers think in similar narrative terms, but the clarity and consistency with which she applied it at her age was striking. Invitations to compose original works began arriving alongside the performance invitations. Orchestras and music festivals that had initially reached out hoping to feature her as a performing soloist began asking whether she might also contribute original compositions to their programs. This was an unusual request to make of any soloist, let alone one who was still in primary school. But the reputation of her compositional work had spread far enough that the requests were genuine and serious. She accepted some of these commissions and worked on them with a focus and dedication that impressed the adults around her, including professional musicians who were accustomed to working with disciplined and serious composers. One festival in particular gave her an extended commission that resulted in a new piano piece performed alongside works by established adult composers. When the program notes were handed out, and audience members read that one of the compositions had been written by an 8-year-old, reactions ranged from amused skepticism to cautious curiosity. Most people assumed they were about to hear something charming and age-appropriate, a piece that would be applauded warmly in the way that audiences applaud children, with generosity rather than genuine critical engagement. What happened instead was that when her piece was performed, the audience response was indistinguishable from the response given to the professional adult composers on the same program. People were not applauding out of encouragement. They were applauding because the music had reached them, and that was a distinction that everyone in the room understood without needing to say it aloud. The opera came as a surprise even to those who had been following Alma's development closely. Performing prodigies occasionally composed short pieces, and a handful of historically gifted children had written instrumental works of genuine merit. But an opera was something else entirely. Opera is arguably the most complex and demanding form of musical composition that exists. It requires a composer to think simultaneously about melody, harmony, orchestration, dramatic pacing, vocal range, theatrical structure, and the relationship between words and music, all while creating something that holds together as a unified artistic experience over the course of an entire evening. Professional composers with years of conservatory training and decades of professional experience often describe opera as the most difficult challenge they have ever attempted. The idea that a child who had not yet reached her 10th birthday was working on a full-length opera was the kind of information that made even people who had already accepted the reality of Alma's abilities stop and reconsider what they thought they understood about her. The opera was called Cinderella, and Alma had chosen the subject herself. This choice was revealing in its own right. She had not selected a story because someone suggested it would be appropriate for a young composer or because it seemed like a safe and manageable subject. She had chosen it because the emotional core of the story genuinely interested her. The themes of being overlooked, of inner worth going unrecognized by the world, of transformation and eventual acknowledgement. Those themes resonated with her in ways that were personal and specific, because in some respects, her own experience of being a child in a world of adults who sometimes struggled to take her seriously had given her a direct understanding of what it felt like to possess something valuable that others were slow to see. She wrote the libretto herself, which added another layer to the already remarkable nature of the project. The libretto of an opera is the text, the words that the characters sing, and writing it requires an understanding of dramatic structure, character development, poetic rhythm, and the particular way that language needs to be shaped in order to work effectively when set to music. Alma worked on the text and the music simultaneously, which is actually the approach that many of history's greatest opera composers have preferred, because it allows the words and the music to develop together in a way that makes them feel genuinely integrated rather than one being awkwardly fitted to the other after the fact. The process of composing the opera took several years, which meant that Alma grew and developed as a musician and as a person during the time she was working on it. This was visible in the finished work in ways that musical scholars found fascinating. The earlier sections of the opera, written when she was younger, had a certain directness and melodic simplicity that was immediately appealing. The later sections, written as she moved through her 9th and 10th years, showed a noticeably more sophisticated harmonic language and a more complex understanding of how to build and release dramatic tension over longer stretches of time. The opera was, in a sense, a document of her growth, a record of a musical mind developing in real time across the span of the work. When the opera was finally performed, the production was staged in a proper opera house with professional adult singers, a full orchestra, and a conductor of considerable reputation. The choice to present it in this way rather than as a student production or a scaled-down educational event was a deliberate statement about how seriously the people involved regarded the work. They were not producing it as a gesture of encouragement toward a gifted child. They were producing it because they believed it deserved to stand alongside professional work and be evaluated on those terms. That confidence in the material turned out to be justified in a way that surprised even some of the optimists involved in the production. Reviews appeared in major publications that covered classical music and opera, and the language critics used was careful and considered in the way that serious music criticism tends to be. Nobody was claiming that a 10-year-old had written a work that surpassed the great operas of the historical canon. That would have been both inaccurate and unhelpful. But the reviews consistently acknowledged that the opera worked as a piece of theater, that the melodies were genuinely beautiful, that the dramatic structure held together across the full length of the evening, and that the vocal writing showed an understanding of the human voice that was unexpected from any composer, let alone one who had lived for such a short time. Several critics noted that there were moments in the opera where the music achieved something that could only be described as genuinely moving, not moving in the way that novelty can be temporarily touching, but moving in the way that great music is moving, by reaching something true about human feeling and giving it a form that an audience could share. Audiences responded with a warmth that went beyond politeness. At the conclusion of the premiere performance, when Alma walked onto the stage to acknowledge the applause, the sight of this small child taking a bow in front of a full opera house that had just spent an evening inside a world she had created from her imagination was an image that stayed with everyone who witnessed it. Some people in the audience cried, not out of sentimentality about her youth, but out of a genuine emotional response to what the evening had been. The music had done what music is supposed to do at its highest level, and the fact that it had been written by a child made it no less real and no less powerful as an artistic experience. Word of the opera spread through the international music community with a speed that reflected genuine excitement rather than manufactured publicity. Conductors and opera directors in cities across Europe and beyond began making inquiries about acquiring the rights to stage their own productions. The conversation around Alma Deutscher was shifting in a way that was subtle but important. She was no longer being discussed primarily as a prodigy, as a remarkable child doing things beyond her years. She was beginning to be discussed as a composer, as an artist with a voice and a body of work that deserved ongoing attention independent of her age.